National Portrait Gallery is accustomed to receiving its fair share of VIPs. Naturally, VIPs also figure prominently and permanently on our walls, including a large number of eminent Commonwealth public servants from the past who've had a lasting impact on the history and shared life of this country. However, it's relatively unusual for the secretaries of Commonwealth Departments of State to visit us more than one at a time, occasionally two by two, but rarely in such large numbers as have converged here this evening. I feel much as one imagines in this moment and in this situation, much as one imagines a fairy penguin might feel, who, emerging from the waves, finds himself ineluctably propelled by forces of nature directly into the path of an entire colony of walrus. Their magnificent tusks glinting in the fading light.
It's a pleasure to be with you tonight, and I realise at the outset that no matter what I say, the one thing that's going to go out of tonight is the imagery of the walruses and the Angus as the little penguin. It could have been worse. We could have been, orcas, in which case you wouldn't have got ashore. Look, it's a huge pleasure to be here with you today, and so I'd like to thank Gordon for the invitation and also thank Angus and the NPG staff for the welcome to this wonderful place. And also let me associate myself with Angus's welcome to country and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people here today. Now, I'm a great believer in celebrating success, acknowledging failure and recognising where we can do better. So to me, it's important that we come together to reflect on the year that has been, especially in a climate of such rapid change here in Australia, but perhaps even more importantly, overseas. So let me start by taking the opportunity to thank you, everybody who's here and everybody who isn't, for your contributions over the past 12 months. When you think about the year that's gone, we can divide it into the pre and post-election, and of course that bit in the middle. Prior to 2 July, we were busy implementing policies of the government and preparing a budget which bore the stamp of our new Prime Minister, our 5th Prime Minister in 6 years. As for every election, we headed to the polls uncertain about the outcome and how it would affect our work. The elongated caretaker period brought with it a new set of challenges, but in my view, the APS supported the working of the government professionally. For some, post-election was business as usual. For others, like so many elections before, and I suspect into the future, there was an adjustment to be made, either to a new minister or to machinery of government changes. Subsequent to the election, we had to navigate the dynamics of a new crossbench, though many in the service already had that experience from the Gillard minority government days. Now, like all second-term governments, the focus of this administration is different to that in its first 3 years. In this second term, the focus is on a domestic agenda of boosting investment, jobs and growth. Since its re-election, the government has progressed reforms in areas such as vocational education and training, superannuation, industrial relations, and ending the perfectly preventable mess that has been vet fee help. It's initiated the Finkel review of the security of the national energy market, and it's continued to deliver real momentum in the campaign against domestic violence. Its second term is also characterised by a sharp focus on implementation of existing commitments. This covers the massive, potentially game-changing investments that are being made in the National Disability Insurance Scheme, the National Broadband Network, the National Innovation and Science Agenda, and in cities and infrastructure. And I haven't even mentioned naval shipbuilding, where the intention is not just to build naval ships, but to build a naval shipbuilding industry capable of holding its own against global metrics. These are huge projects with absolutely enormous impacts on Australia, and the challenge of delivery cannot be underestimated. The shipbuilding work alone will see government investment in capital of around $89 billion over the coming decades. Think of the cost to Australia in foregone opportunities. Think of the opportunity cost, in other words, if we get the implementation of that wrong. And this all occurs against the backdrop of the increasing urgency to restore our fiscal position. On current plans, we return to surplus in 2021, over a decade after we slipped into deficit, and 8 years later than we first projected a surplus back in 2012-13. Now, it's really easy to blame this on the Senate, but Australian governments have rarely controlled the Senate. You've got to go back to 2004 to 2007, or then you have to go back to 1980 to 83 to find a period where we had a government that controlled the Senate. So to me, the issue is not control of the Senate, it's the fragmented vision of Australia's future that causes the biggest difficulty that we face today. And it's that fragmentation of our vision for Australia that is being reflected in the composition of the Parliament. Efforts to return Australia to fiscal health are hampered by the unwillingness of the community to acknowledge the risks Australia is taking. But if the community will not acknowledge it today, watch how they attribute blame if the rating agencies remove our AAA credit rating. Globally, economic growth remains sluggish. In many developed countries, inequality has risen and the public feels as though the social compact is broken. That's led to a backlash against free trade, against globalisation, against foreign investment and against immigration. Yet, despite the superficial attraction of such attitudes, if Australians want a resilient economy, we need a serious commitment to improving productivity growth and a fundamental openness to trade and investment that brings with it the new jobs and competitive firms that we will need in the decades ahead. The Prime Minister has been absolutely forthright in his belief that the generation of ideas is the key to our economic success and that we must make innovation and disruption our friend if we're to keep pace with the world. Now, we've heard that phrase many times, disruption and innovation. I've talked about it in speeches over the last couple of years. I've talked about it in terms of what it means for our economy and for our organisation, that is the APS. I've espoused it on panels and I've robustly suggested that APS staff embrace it. But I realised recently that I'd never really spoken in detail about what it means for the APS. And perhaps that's why I shouldn't be surprised by my conclusion when I look back over the course of the year. In my first year as head of the public service, I've been very impressed with a whole range of things that I've seen. But one thing that surprised me has been complacency. And I don't use that word lightly. I really do mean complacency, which many in the public service have regarding the disruptive forces operating around us and operating on us. Disruptive forces like the fundamental shift in public expectations of government, consumer-directed demand for government services, and the ever-changing capacity of technology to support and improve service delivery are certainly not unique to the public sector. They impact on our work as much as they impact on the work of the private sector. But despite this, it seems that many in the APS think that disruption is something that is happening to other people. And conversely, we have a view that innovation is either a buzzword or something that's nice to have. I want to be clear, that's a false reality and a dangerous one. It feeds into the concern that I've expressed previously at a previous IPAA event that we in the APS are at risk of a fatal combination of ignorance and arrogance. So what do I mean when I talk about innovation in the APS? What does it look like on a day-to-day basis for the graduate, doing a rotation, for the EL2 and HR, for the secretary of a department? First, we have to be an organisation that stops squirming at the word failure. I know we've had it ingrained in us for so long that failure is inexcusable that we've either risk managed the life out of decisions or we've simply refused to admit when we are taking risk. But look at our reality. We're an organisation with some incredible high-profile failures. I already mentioned Vet Fee Help, which was entirely preventable. We knew the lessons to be taken from some of the other programs, such as the home insulation program, e-health, this year the census, or the failure to effectively de-identify health records. We know, but we keep making the same sorts of mistakes, and we have to keep asking ourselves why. What is it about the way in which we think about doing things that's leading us to repeat these issues? Now, there is an acceptable level of failure. I'm not suggesting to anyone that you go rogue and go out and adopt the "I'd rather seek forgiveness than seek permission" mantra, because that's often just an excuse for poor preparation or a disregard for process. We have to do our due diligence, we have to base decisions on a solid evidence base, and we have to operate within some kind of structure. But if we're going to truly create a safe space for people to innovate, take risk, we need to create better frameworks to test ideas. Better still, to emulate General Electric, we should be prepared to fail fast and then decide to persevere or pivot. That is, based on data analytics and clear-eyed judgment, did we make a mistake at the outset and this is not something that we can rectify? Or is it something that if we just take a step back and fine-tune it, there's something here that we can continue to persevere with? We have to learn and we have to recognise early that what are we seeing? Is it an unacceptable level of failure, or whether it's something that's absolutely okay and is rectifiable if we do a bit of fine-tuning of our project? Our relatively weak capacity to evaluate potential success and impending failure, though, suggests to me we've got a capability gap. The fact that we keep repeating this does seem to me that we've got some problems in around project management capabilities and skills. We've got some some weaknesses around risk management, and frankly, we're not being sufficiently open in putting on the table what we see as the real risks around initiatives. So how do we deal with that? Well, the first thing is to be honest. Honest analysis, honest ability to assess risk and develop risk mitigation and minimisation strategies. They have to become core skills for us if we're going to successfully venture into this brave new world of disruption and innovation. And we don't have any choice. We're going to be dragged into it, whether we want to do it or not, so we better arm ourselves. Yes, innovation can take courage, but increasingly, I'd say to you, it's going to be expected of everyone in the service. We've got a Prime Minister who's an early adopter of technology and puts a lot of stead in its ability to transform the way in which we work. Now, in its own way, the PM&C incoming government brief team rose to that as we were preparing the post-election briefing. The IGB team took an idea that had been developed in the Department of Communications and Arts under the Prime Minister when he'd been Minister, and we worked with our own IT and security colleagues and developed a new user-friendly way of delivering the IGB electronically. Now, anybody who's worked on an IGB knows how diabolically difficult as a process that these things can be. But this was more than just an app. It was an entire new way of thinking about how to engage the Prime Minister, thinking about him as the client and asking what is it about this client, about the way in which they operate, that we need to be able to tap into. And I have to say, it's been a resounding success. It allowed the Prime Minister to ask questions, receive answers, and make decisions on briefs in real time and remotely. And he's very keen that we roll this approach out more generally. So we've already started doing it for QTBs, and we're already doing it now for our international briefing. So a situation where he's travelling internationally, his briefing is all done in the same way as the IGB pack, it's being updated remotely, he's asking questions interactively, and it's the product's evolving in front of his eyes as he's on the road. Now, why do I mention that? Not because we deserve a particular pat on the back, but it's because we actually ask ourselves a question: how do we deal with this particular citizen, this particular client? How do we actually make life easier for them, rather than thinking of it in terms of how we've traditionally done things? And I'd suggest to you that it might be useful to ask the same question. Is there a way in which you can take our idea here, which, as I said, was actually originally a Department of Communications idea, or ideas that other departments are doing, and ask how you can use that in your department to serve your minister, your team? How can you build on the ideas of other people? I keep saying plagiarism is a sin in academia, it's a virtue in public policy. We've got to get better at not having every single one of us reinvent the wheel. But innovation is not confined just to technological change. Indeed, the APS and the government have to think completely differently when it comes to policy development and implementation. This year, Christian Porter, the Minister for Social Services, announced a trial of the Australian investment approach to welfare. Now, the provision of income support is by no means a new policy, but through the investment approach, he's trying a totally different data-driven approach in order to try and get a better outcome. Rather than providing a series of short-term fixes, he's used big data and data analytics to draw an actuarial analysis applied to 15 years worth of Social Security, ABS and longitudinal data to better identify which groups in our community are most likely to be long-term recipients of welfare, and to ask where is the best point to intervene to help those people break welfare dependency. This evidence base, which had not previously been compiled, and so it we'd never had the capability to access it, allows funding to go to specific groups at specific times within their individual life cycle, where the data suggests will have the most chance of breaking that welfare dependency. Now, one of the groups most vulnerable to long-term dependence on welfare is 11,000 young carer payment recipients under 25. Just to put this in context, the data that Minister Porter had available to him when all this was pulled together suggested to us that over the next 70 years, a minimum of 40% of that 11,000 Australians under 25 can be expected to access income support arrangements. On average, those 11,000 young carers are expected to be on income support at some point in each year in 43 separate years over their life. You think about it, we've got young people who we're basically, if we don't try and intervene, we're sitting here essentially consigning them to having 43 years of their life when they're going to be dependent upon income support payments. So just think of the power of what this investment approach may be able to do. 16% of that group of 11,000, so around about 1,800 young people, will access income support each and every year of their life. So we're adopting a fresh approach here. We're combining the right data and the right analytic capacity, and that's giving us a remarkable instrument to try and improve the effectiveness of our social service interventions. And it's a data-driven, targeted approach to payments. What do we get out of it? Yep, government gets a better outcome from its spend, but the biggest win is that those vulnerable people are likely to have greater control over their lives and are likely to lead more worthwhile lives because they will not be consigned to that sort of particular echelon in our community. The staged implementation of the Australian investment approach is also, I think, a fantastic example of small-scale policy testing. That is, creating the framework in which to test the merits of a policy idea while accepting it might not work. So the $96 million Try, Test and Learn Fund exists to seek innovative ideas from experts within and outside government, including the social sector, on different types of interventions to target these different groups. So how can we do things differently to try and achieve the investment approach goals, and to rigorously evaluate these trials, these pilots, before we roll them out to full-scale implementation. I think this is an absolutely phenomenally important structural reform. If we can actually do this, this is a sort of area, this is a sort of approach that won't just be applied in the social welfare space, it can be applied all over public policy. And so we should be thinking of this as absolutely one of the great, potentially great structural reforms of this decade. Now, I mentioned about plagiarism, so I should also be upfront. The Australian investment approach, much like Crowded House and Pavlova, has been borrowed from our Kiwi cousins. But like the successful Aussie PAV, we gave it a bit of a twist. And we did that because it made sense to change it slightly to fit with our circumstances. So I really encourage you to think about these sorts of things as opportunities for innovation. But remember, innovation is not the same as invention. Neither of those two examples I've talked about as somebody sitting in a white coat in a lab somewhere mixing together chemicals in a beaker, or basically having a brainwave that says, I'm going to change and do something utterly completely different. Only very occasionally are the ideas behind innovation truly original. Most of the time, innovation is simply the result of the adoption or adaptation of an existing idea. So we shouldn't be too scared of it. We should think of it as something that it's not that scary, but we've just got to be more open-minded about it. So the tools, in my view, the tools we need to make our working lives easier or more productive and responsive already exist. We just have to take a step back and ask ourselves a what-if question. What if I ask my teammates, or indeed the rest of my department, or even more scarily still perhaps the community, for their ideas? What if I make all roles flex in my department? What if I stop flogging a dead cat and look differently at a persistently difficult policy question? So I think there are many ways in which we can recognise disruptive forces and actively choose to innovate and embrace them, rather than playing catch-up or being left behind as citizens and businesses' needs evolve. So I'd say there's only one certainty in the current environment, and that is simple. If we don't embrace innovation, if we don't recognise the disruptive forces that are occurring around us, if we don't get on board with the ethos of the Prime Minister's espoused, the APS will be left behind. And if we're left behind, we'll become irrelevant. And as Fiona Stanley says, what is the point of getting up each day to be mediocre? Now, without a doubt, doing things differently comes with a level of emotional discomfort, resistance, including at times from ministers. And if failing fast is to be part of our ethos, both ministers and the ANAO need to be more realistic about what that entails. The ability to recognise and be comfortable with ambiguity is a key skill, in my mind, of high-performing leaders in the APS, no matter what level. Leadership's not about what you know, but it's about how you act. It's about your values, your behaviours, the environment you contribute to creating, the way you respond to failure, the message you send. In times of uncertainty and change, quality leadership is more important than ever. And as I said, we're living in a world of great uncertainty and rapid change. So we, as the leaders of the APS, need to be able to lead through those times when we're not sure what the outcome will be, and yet still keep our teams calm and focused. Now, my colleague Finn Pratt has led the Secretary's Talent Council work in isolating 5 key attributes for what we think was required in our most senior APS roles as we look out over the decade ahead. These attributes or capabilities are, first, to be visionary. That is, to be able to think about what's happening in the world. Second, to be influential. It's not good enough actually having ideas if you can't communicate them in a way that's going to get people to understand what you want. Third, to be collaborative, because none of us now are sole agents in terms of what we produce. Fourth, to be enabling, to actually help people, build them, create the capability in them so that they can do things. And fifth, to be entrepreneurial. Now, I spoke earlier of the importance of undertaking due diligence to back up new thinking. And I think building the evidence base for new ideas is the surefire way to mitigate against some of that emotional discomfort associated with approaching problems in a way differently to what we've done previously. So how successfully we do this is critical to developing a successful ideas ecosystem across the public service. And that concept of an ideas ecosystem across the service is something which I'm actually quite passionate about, because to me it basically translates into our ability to generate and prosecute new initiatives. I spoke earlier about some of the settings we need to do that. A rebalancing of our risk appetite, an inclusive and respectful environment in which to test ideas, and the commitment to back our proposals with an evidence base. But a successful ideas ecosystem also requires each of us as leaders to invest in ourselves, to read widely about current affairs and policy, to look beyond the scope of your own designated policy area, to develop and invest in communities of practice, to share and learn new ideas. Our Prime Minister, for example, is incredibly interested in initiatives being implemented successfully and unsuccessfully overseas. So I'd say the way to deal with it is, in short, to be bold, to be curious, to be engaged with your work, and to have the courage to act, to realise outcomes where you think they can be improved. Don't do something because we did it that way yesterday. If you're going to do something, do it because you happen to think it's the best way in which we can do something. So another question I think we need to ask ourselves as a service, are we bringing in the right people to help achieve these objectives? I think there are a couple of areas on which we need to focus on. One's diversity. In short, we have to stop picking people like ourselves. And when you stand up here and look around this room, most of us are like one another. The Race Discrimination Commissioner, Dr. Tim Soutphommasane, recently released a publication which he spoke to the APS 200 about, called Leading for Change, a blueprint for cultural diversity and inclusive leadership. It showed that of the 124 heads of federal and state departments, only 2 came from a non-European heritage. And that's halved since Peter Varghese retired. And only 1 had an Indigenous background across all the Commonwealth and state public services. The vast majority, 82% of us, have an Anglo-Celtic background. So in other words, we are less diverse than the ASX 200 CEOs. We are less diverse than the Federal Parliament. And that's why the Secretary's Board has established Equality and Diversity Council to drive initiatives to break down formal and informal barriers preventing all APS staff, no matter what their background or circumstance, reaching their potential. So as an aside, hands up if you've actually heard of the Talent Council. I've got to say you're doing a lot better than the last group I asked that question of, but those of you who haven't should ask yourself why. It's also the issue of gender diversity. A key focus of the Council's work is delivering the APS's gender equality strategy, which is a mandatory set of requirements for all departments and agencies. So hands up who's heard of the gender equality strategy. Same phenomenon the last time I asked the question. More people have heard about the Talent Council than heard about the gender equality strategy. I think that just says naked self-interest will win out in the end. So go back and ask yourself about those 5 attributes that the Talent Council's identified and think about where you might line up against those, and then think about naked self-interest. So let me finish up by reflecting on some remarks made by the Prime Minister early this year when he spoke to IPAA. At that time, he talked to us about the clay layer, as he called it, which can stunt progress in an organisation. It's usually those who are not digital natives and refuse to embrace technology out of fear or stubbornness, or who, being in powerful positions, can impact on its uptake through the organisation. But as I've made clear, I hope I've made clear, it's not just our ability to engage with technology, but our capacity to come up with new policy ideas and our ability to be influential in prosecuting those ideas that is really innovation. So we need to ask ourselves, where's the clay layer that's obstructing our innovative thinking and our recognition of the opportunities inherent in the environment that's developing around us? It must not be because, as they say in the classics, and for those of you who can work out which classic this one is, resistance is futile. It's not only futile, it's foolish. So innovation starts with every one of us. No matter what level we are, no matter what department we're in or agency we're in, we all need to ask ourselves the question, how can we do things differently? Not just because we want to do them differently, but how can we do them differently so that we can do them better? As public servants, I firmly believe we deal in the creation, implementation and assessment of ideas. So we are a natural home for innovation and blue sky thinking. And I don't think there's anything new in what I've said today. If you look back over the speeches that my secretary colleagues have given through the course of this year at IPAA, and I'm talking about Mike Pizzullo, Martin Bowles, Jane Holton, Heather Smith, Dennis Richardson, Finn Pratt, the same themes I've talked about today are in their speeches. So if you have all of the secretaries standing up in IPAA in 2016 using slightly different language but talking about exactly the same sets of issues, the message should be pretty clear. So my challenge to you for 2017, be bold and creative in your thinking. Take a wider view of the world around you and create a working environment where your colleagues feel valued and safe in bringing different ideas to the table and promoting collaboration. Scott Anthony, who's the partner of a consulting firm, InnoSight, sums up innovation in the workplace as follows. It's the courage to choose, the clarity to focus, the curiosity to explore, and the conviction to persevere. That, to me, should be the attributes of leaders in the APS. I think we've got the capacity to do it, and I want us to try and do even more than what we've done today. I've got every confidence that we can innovate, that we can manage in this disruptive environment, that we can create the ideas ecosystem. And I thank you for all of the work you've done this year, and encourage you to think about what you can do for next year. But before you worry too much about next year, I hope you have a fantastic holiday season. I hope you get to spend it with friends and loved ones, and that whatever you do, you travel safely and come back in the new year refreshed, invigorated, and ready to be more innovative. Thank you very much.
Dr. Parkinson, my name is Greg Heath from the Department of Social Services. I've actually worked in quite a lot of agencies, and I think one of the things that I might be so bold to point out is when we look at the benefit of the DSS doing the 11-year research, they actually went back and researched material they already had. I think one of the things that we don't do as agencies is actually go through stuff we already have. I often see that, and I manage information, I often see that people want the next best shiny thing. I see that from all levels, as opposed to actually utilising what they already have and getting the best out of that. So I'm just intrigued as your thoughts around, exploring a little bit more of what we already have to get more benefit out of that.
Yeah, look, I think that's a really good question. And I think one of the best ways to explore what we've got is actually to release more public data. Because I reckon one of the best things that we can do is stop hoarding data and information inside agencies where, frankly, I think we often hoard it because we see it gives us some sort of advantage in the budgetary process, or we think that the privacy rules somehow prevent us from doing things which in fact they actually don't, more often than not. And so I'm absolutely, along with the Secretary's Committee on Data, absolutely keen that we put more and more data out publicly, that we create trusted users who can actually link data sets, and they can be inside the public service and outside the public service, and that we actually expose the data to a whole bunch of smart people who don't happen to be inside the public service or happen to be in other parts of the public service, so that we can actually get better value out of what we've already got. So you chance your arm, go forth and put out as much as you can.
Thanks, Rosemary Huxtable from Finance. Martin, you spoke about the fiscal challenge, obviously, and you also talked about innovation in the policy space. Reflecting on the fact that around 7%, depending on how you count it, of our spending is in social services, welfare, health and education. And these are areas where the states are very much participants and players. I'm just wondering if you can reflect on where you think the opportunities are to work with the states or innovatively with the states to achieve sort of the public policy objectives in those areas in particular.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Rosemary. It does seem to me that one of the things that we perhaps have done a bit too much of is think that we've got to get a uniform national solution in each space, which is where we have a joint responsibility with the states. I'm actually, I think, and I'll be frank, I think I started there. I think I've become much more convinced that I would rather see the Commonwealth work in particular areas of education or social welfare or indigeneity, housing, whatever, with states that were prepared to experiment, which had a like-minded approach to us, without trying to get ourselves the all-embracing intergovernmental agreement or national partnership that runs the risk of driving us to the lowest common denominator. I think we'd be better off trying to do things with states where there is an ambition to try and do something different, and then use that as demonstrations. The states are sovereign in their own right, but I think it's very hard if they can see success in some areas and that it's not being pursued in their own. Their citizens will begin to demand that they do things differently. So I think the approach to city deals, for example, which is really interesting, will they work? Don't know, but we're better off for having a go at them than continuing to do the same things which we know have failed. But we've got Western Sydney, we've got Townsville, we've got Launceston. All of them are different. Will they all be successful? Don't know. Will any of them be successful? Sure hope so, given the amount of effort we're putting in. But at the very least, we're thinking about things differently. Another one's value capture, sticking with the sort of the planning idea. We've put out a discussion paper on value capture. Completely different way to start to think about funding infrastructure. We've just seen with the light rail in New South Wales, in Sydney, the one that's going down George Street and out to Kensington, a developer has offered to pay the entire cost of extending it out to, I think it's to Chippendale, I think that's right, because they're sitting on a big plot of land out there which they think is a fantastic redevelopment opportunity. So think about it, if New South Wales government does that, that's actually value capture. It's different to what we've got in our discussion paper, but it's a way of value capture. The value that would otherwise accrete to the developer is actually being shared with the people of New South Wales. So I think, you know, whether it's in the human services space, where quite frankly consumer-directed provision of service, I think, is only going to continue to increase, and we know that some states will be more innovative in that area than others, or whether it's in early childhood education or schools. I think there's just lots of areas where we should move away from the one-size-fits-all model and try and do things in a more plurilateral or bilateral manner. And then don't be shy about the results. You know, if it hasn't worked, admit it hasn't worked, and we'll find out why. If it has worked, get out there and proselytise about it to the rest of the community and encourage other states to pursue it.
Hello, Martin. Thank you.
Hi.
That was a great speech. Louise McSorley from the Employment Department. At the top of your speech, you talked about the makeup of the Senate, and perhaps it reflects a sense of we're not clear who we are as Australians. So I wondered if you could unpick that a little bit, and perhaps I haven't quite paraphrased it correctly, but then also, is there a role for the public service in a clarity of vision around what it means to be Australian?
I think it's a function of the disruption. So if you look at the media, it's clearly disrupted. Old media is you know, dying. It's trying to work out how to evolve. New media is developing and evolving far more rapidly. People are getting their information different ways. They're getting information from communities of people who think like them, this capacity to actually filter out any views that don't agree with you. And I think that's actually leading to reinforcement of this fragmentation. And I think it makes it really hard for politicians to actually work out how to get a narrative that works in that area. So I think it's incumbent upon us not to pretend that we can do something that others can't do, but to acknowledge just how difficult it is for politicians now, and to ask ourselves, are we as public servants doing everything we can to help our governments deliver on what they've gone to the public with? Because at the end of the day, remember, the Act is pretty clear. The way I tend to paraphrase it is we serve the people of Australia through the government of the day. So it's not up to us as public servants to somehow see that we've got a role that's independent of the political class in terms of constructing a narrative, but I think it is incumbent upon us to actually be out there engaging with the community, hearing the community, explaining the circumstances, how they're changing, and trying to help people understand the pros and cons of different approaches. But that's, you know, there's a very important distinction between describing and advocating, and we've always got to remember that we're public servants and we've got to remain on the right side of that line.
Dr. Parkinson, my name's Lara. I'm from the Department of Immigration and Border Protection. This might build on the last question that you were asked, but looking at the wider global context and, you know, President-elect Trump and Brexit earlier in the year and rise of nationalism globally, what do you see the role of the public service, or whether we do have a role in instilling trust and confidence in governance in Australia?
Oh, I actually think we're absolutely central to trust and confidence, and that's why failures, particularly high-profile failures, actually damage people's trust in government. And they don't think because the government failed in X, and by now I'm not talking about any specific government, there's a small g government, because government has failed in area X, it's only X that we're not very good at. They actually just use that shorthand to paint pictures of government, and I don't think they distinguish very clearly between the different levels of government either. So I actually think it is quite important for us as public servants to think about that a key part of what we're doing is maintaining trust of the Australian people in the institutions of government, and that means that we have to act with absolute integrity. APS values didn't just arise out of the ether. They were carefully developed over a very, very long period of time, building on the sort of approach that Nethercote and Trevelyan took all those hundreds of years ago in the UK. And they're the sorts of things that we've got to hold dear to. We have to act with absolute integrity in the way in which we do our jobs. And if we do, then we're doing the best we can to maintain integrity in the institutions of government.
Can I thank you, Martin, very much for your comments tonight. They're practical, they're inspiring, they're very important, and for your honest exchange. And we look forward very much to your address next year, and we can see the progress that we've achieved there. We'll have a small gift, and unusually the gift is not alcohol.
You mean unusually for me?
No, not at all. But on behalf of the IPAA, thank you very much.
Thanks.
Please join me.